Creationism versus evolution. We're talking about the water, catastrophic flood, and what are evidences and scientific information that would back up one or the other, evolutionism or creationism. Let's go to K 33b, and look for the following question. The following question is the key to this study. What will a no-boundary global ocean do when subjected to the force of attraction of the moon? Tidal waves. We have a single landmass, perhaps, not the continental shelf that we have now, which interrupts with different continents and breaks up the size of the tidal wave. So the greater the tidal action, the greater would be the amount of work that could be done in layering down the sediments, and the quicker it would get done. From the huge volume of sedimentary rock extent upon the Earth, it must be postulated that the responsible mechanism was of broad scope and great power. The phenomenon of resonance has been put forth as one means of increasing the ability of the tides to do the work. In the calculation, the global ocean resonated only when the fluid friction was reduced. You don't have a lot of objects to slow the wave down. Even though the interaction between the moon and the completely flooded planet Earth is multifaceted and complex, this action follows the basic laws of mechanics. Resonance would have augmented the tidal amplitudes, which in turn would have augmented the velocity fields, especially near the bottom where the sediment transport and deposition would have occurred. This is not uniformitarianism. This is a catastrophic, unique event because of a whole bunch of water and because of the landmass being a single landmass in the world instead of broken up into continental shelves. You can do further investigative study. You look at answers in genesis.org or just do a Google research on this. Dr. Don Patton says, when we realize the sediment transport principle, we know that a new bedding plane is formed if the current of sediment-bearing water changes direction. If the water changes temperature, and if it changes velocity, which can be caused by the texture of the bottom and by the rate of drop, there are about 17 factors that have to remain absolutely constant in order to have one homogeneous bed formed. And you change any of it, and you've got a new bedding plane. So how long can you maintain all of these factors perfectly uniform? Seconds, maybe minutes, not hundreds of thousands or millions of years. And that's what we see illustrated in the fossil record, rapid formation of the rocks, which is obvious to people that will look and will think, understanding that one of the more famous evolutionists in the world, Stephen Gould of Harvard, made a very interesting statement about the rocks and their formation. He said, catastrophists, and of course, these are the ones that oppose the uniformitarians, which were the evolutionists, and talking about the situation, of course, years ago. Catastrophists, who were the creationists, he said, were as committed to science as any graduate. In fact, they adopted the more objective that one should believe what one sees and not interpolate missing bits of gradual record into a literal tale of rapid change. Don't imagine things between the fossils when you don't see anything. So now what we actually see is rapidity. But they quite know that this was deposited over billions of years, and so they divide the time into the rocks and they say, this is at least the average time it was formed. But the actual time is, of course, in between the rocks because we see indications that they were all formed rapidly. So in between the rocks, there's nothing. They're interpolating missing bits into a literal tale of rapid change. I think I'd just rather take it literally, just the facts as they are without imposing the philosophy upon it. And imposing such a philosophy is what's necessary in order to come out where the fossil record is old. That's not the literal story. That's the imagined scenario that's imposed on the actual facts. Even when it contradicts the facts, they go back to the imagined scenario. In any case, we have early burial of marine creatures, and we continue to study the fossil record. And it continues to support, by the great preponderance of information, the worldwide flood. Of course, in localities where more than one system is found exposed or revealed by well logging or other means, it is frequently found that the lowermost strata are most of those containing the simpler and therefore supposedly more ancient organisms, usually marine organisms, But this, however, does not all evidence evolution as commonly claimed, but rather testifies quite plainly that these marine creatures were, as would be expected, deposited first and deepest in the deluge sediments because they're already in the water. Two factors combined to make this a general, though by no means inviolable rule. The sea bottoms, both deep and shallow seas, would have been first affected by the breaking up of the foundations of the great deep. This inference is corroborated by the fact that those strata found usually lowest in the column are marine strata containing marine organisms. With reference to the Cambrian strata, supposedly the oldest foliferous strata. But at least 1,500 species of invertebrates are known in the Cambrian, all marine, of which 60% are trilobites and 30% brachiopods. Now, Maurice Gignaud, the same could largely be said of the Ordovician, Silurian, and Devonian periods as far as their fauna, animal life, are concerned. Although there are evidence of continental-type flora, plant life in the latter, it is not until the Permian-Carboniferous is reached, well up in the geologic column, that the first land animals are encountered. That's because their properties are less dense, less spherical, and more of an unamorphous shape. Later burial of land animals and plants. Let's investigate. What does this point to? In other localities, and perhaps somewhat later in the period of the rising waters of the flood, in general, land animals and plants would be expected to be caught in the sediments and buried. This is, of course, exactly what the strata show. Of course, this would be only a general rule, and there would be many exceptions, as currents would be intermingling from all directions. So you have one current slamming into another, bang, deposit whatever it has in it. Then another one comes from another option, bang, and deposits more, maybe of the same or different, out of order. That's what we see in the world. Of course, this would be only a general rule, and there would be many exceptions, as currents would be intermingling from all directions, as I said, particularly as the lands become increasingly submerged and more amphibians, reptiles, and mammals were overtaken by the waters. They knew enough to escape. They weren't marine animals. They were land animals. They just go to higher ground until finally the water just comes in and drowns them. One would certainly not expect to find in any one locality a continuous series of all the possible types of strata. The actual deposits would depend on the local circumstances of current direction and sediment source areas and the manner in which these changed during the course of the flood period. But in general, though, as a statistical average, beds would tend to be deposited in just the order that has been ascribed to them in terms of the standard geologic column. That is, on top of the beds of marine vertebrates would be found amphibians, and then reptiles, and finally birds and mammals. This is in the order, increasing mobility, and therefore increasing ability to postpone inundation. They're running from it, and they then ultimately get drowned. Of decreasing density, and other hydrodynamic factors tend to promote earlier and deeper sedimentation, and the increasing elevation of the habitat. So the mountainous dwelling of mammals are going to be last, and therefore time required for the flood to attain stages sufficient to overtake them. And usually they're more complex. The order is exactly what is to be expected in light of the flood account, and therefore gives further circumstantial evidence of the truthfulness of that account. In no sense is it necessary to say that this order is evidence of organic evolution from one stage into the next. It might support it, except for the fact that it's never the same anywhere. So you have complex life forms that are above, or below, rather, less complex life forms because of the way the water is from multi-directions deposited itself. And the fact that, although this order is generally to be expected, it is found to have many exceptions, both in terms of omissions and inversions. It is also certainly to be expected in terms of evolution and uniformity. So it is in the so-called Permian and Carboniferous periods, near the top of the Paleozoic strata, that it remains of land animals are first encountered. This, therefore, marks an important stage in the onset of the deluge water, when the smaller and less agile of the amphibians and reptiles were overtaken and swept into the deluge sediments. The faster mammals might have gone further up, higher up, especially the ones dwelled higher up in the mountains. But how do we account for the fact that we find segregated plants and animals? Dr. Patton says we do find that in the lowest layer, plants and animals that we don't find in the upper layer, the Mississippian. Well, I think that the explanation is presented for us in the book Principles of Geology by Gillooly, Walters, and Woodford. They say in correlating rock strata by comparison of fossils, it is important to keep in mind the limitations to the spread of organisms imposed by their natural habitats. Many different depositional environments exist, not all the same according to the textbook. Each environment has its characteristic group of animals and plants that live contemporaneously. In other words, these groups are different and they're separate, not because they lived millions of years apart from each other, but because they lived in different places. And so they got buried in different places. And if we have a catastrophic flood burying the world that then was, the waters would begin to rise, and we would see that those buried in the lowest would be those that lived in the lowest, and the ones next would be those that lived a little bit higher, he says. For example, we did not expect to find the bones of antelopes in a coral reef, nor coral in a desert sand dune. We would not expect to find the same fossils entombed in all the various deposits formed. They're different, even though they are contemporaneous. The flood would bury those organisms that lived lowest first, and then the general order of burial would be reflected due to the natural habitat. We don't find this anywhere in its complete form, but you do find the general order. You don't expect to find a human footprint at the bottom of the ocean. But if you ever find things which are supposed to be millions of years apart in each other's footprints, you know that their explanation of being millions of years apart, that won't work. We were warned by David Raup about this when he says, one of the ironies of the creation-evolution debate is that the creationists have accepted the mistaken notion that the fossil record shows a detailed, orderly progression. It doesn't. And they have gone to great lengths to accommodate this fact into their flood geology. You can't fantasize on either side of the question. David Raup. He, of course, points out that there is no such thing, and you don't have to have an explanation for a detailed, orderly progression because it does not exist. He readily acknowledges that it is a mistaken notion, as he tells us. Compare the rest of this quotation from Dr. Patton's notes. A large number of well-trained scientists outside of evolutionary biology and paleontology have unfortunately gotten the idea that the fossil record is far more Darwinian than it is. This probably comes from the oversimplification inevitable in secondary sources, low-level textbooks, semi-popular articles, and so on. Also, there's a probable some wishful thinking involved. In the years after Darwin, his advocates hoped to find predictable progressions. And when they didn't, these have not been found, so yet the optimum has died hard. Some pure fantasy has crept into textbooks. What we see and when we look at the fossil record, it's billions of dead things in rocks laid down all over the world. We're living on a veritable graveyard. Billions of dead things in rocks laid down by water all over the world is eloquent testimony to the fact that there was a great catastrophe. So Dr. Patton goes on to say, the millions of fossils that we see in the museums around the world and the rocks provide convincing proof for creation. Certainly evidence that would sustain that concept. Let's begin with a statement made by Stanley, paleontologist from Johns Hopkins. He says, it's doubtful whether in the absence of fossils the idea of evolution would represent anything more than an outrageous hypothesis. The fossil record, and only the fossil record, provides direct evidence of major sequential changes in the Earth's biota. So, let's go back to the higher mobility of the vertebrates. It is reasonable also in the light of the flood record to expect that vertebrates would be found higher in the geologic column than the first invertebrates. Vertebrates in general possess much greater mobility, and this factor together with their pelagic habitats would normally prevent their being entrapped and deposited in the deepest sediments. The simplest vertebrates, the ostracoderms, primitive armored type fish, are first found, and only sparingly then in the supposed Ordovician strata. Fishes are found in profusion in the Devonian, often in great sedimentary graveyards, indicating violent deposition and often in freshwater deposits. It is obvious that fish do not normally die and become fossilized in such conditions as these, but usually are either destroyed by scavengers or float on the surface until decomposed. The whole aspect of the fossil fish beds speaks of violent burial in rapidly moving deltaic sediments. The source of these masses of sediments in which the marine vertebrates were entombed is largely continental in nature. This, for example, is true of the most famous of the Devonian fish beds, those of the old red sandstone of Great Britain, and of the corresponding Catskill mountain formations of the United States. The character of these deposits seems explicable only in terms of torrential streams